All right, Craig Robbins here, getting ready to respond to these week 2 questions. Here we go. All right, the first question, does the American attitude toward rules that Orior says can be easily seen in athletic competition also manifests itself in business, law, and other institutions that search for loopholes and other strategic ways to circumvent rules? Just going back to what Orior says in regards to the British, essentially they operate from a place of class and status. So, therefore everyone just kind of falls in line. Whereas Americans are more about, the greater good of the people. And in there, Orior talks about Americans mentioning they're the people of the middle class. In that, I kind of, from the perspective of Americans, I kind of see how we operate, over the past several years, or even in today's era. If you apply that same mindset in regards to Americans being of the middle class, or in my interpretation of for the people, you can look at from a sports standpoint where the reason why we have free agency in sports to some degree, most people feel, is the history of Curt Flood. He was a former Major League Baseball player who challenged the free agency, so to speak. But before, it was more so, guys were under contract, and teams can do as they please with their player. So I believe in the late 60s, early 70s, Curt Flood basically opposed a trade. He and a few other players were going to be shipped from the St. Louis Cardinals to the Phillies, I believe. And he just took a stance and said no. And so eventually he challenged the rule. The saying was referred to as the Reserve Act, which the ruling is in which he challenged. Took years and years of back and forth as far as going through court. Had to sit out a year of baseball in the early 70s, and finally, they ruled in his favor. And years later, we have free agency due to of his fighting and taking a stance and being for player movement. So I mean, that's one of many instances in sports, and relating it to business. You can talk about people being involved in unions and strikes. For example, ironically, I was watching a documentary, and it was talking about Ford Motor Company in the early 1930s, regarding the labor strike and the sit-down strike, where literally the employees occupied the facility. They literally sat down due to labor battles with Ford Motors and things like that. And other companies across the country had similar situations. But yeah, they literally had to sit down, slowing down operations, obviously potentially affecting Ford Motors' business by actually sitting down and striking, basically hindering the company's ability to bring in scabs or people crossing the picket line to potentially take over their jobs, given that they were on strike. And so, with that, things went about, and they finally, a change came about in that regard. Another example you can apply to Americans and their way of challenging things. You can go back to civil rights. You can talk about women's inability to vote many moons ago. You can talk about the African Americans and the struggles, and the Jim Crow laws, and not being able to drink at a certain fountain, not being able to sit at the front of the bus. Given our American-like makeup, we were able to challenge those rules. Unfortunately, many people had to endure a lot of pain, had to for lack of a better phrase, be the sacrificial lamb in that situation. But things came about due to our American-like ways, and as far as challenging different things, and you can relate it to the military and transgenders and gays and all that stuff involved in the military. Back in the day that wasn't of the norm, and now that is of our norm. I mean, you can reference many different facets of life in regards to relating this topic to Americans trying to be about the people and demonstrate their ways of searching for loopholes and circumventing rules in whatever realm that one may be involved in. And then the second question, it says, to what degree does sport reflect society and society reflect sport? This actually kind of hits home with me. I really feel like sports and society kind of go hand in hand. For example, I coach for the Azusa Pacific football team, and one of our sayings is, we want to build champions while pursuing championships. And I really feel like football, sports in general, but specifically football, is a direct correlation to life and, the development of young, in my case, young men. We talk about building champions. We want to build champions in life, as far as obviously character is a huge, element to that. Obviously the academic portion is big. The religion element is obviously just as big. So we tie that in, and in us trying to be good men and develop, quality people to be the future of our universe. We also want to win football games, in the same fashion. Ironically, was it about a week or so ago, we had one of our former players come speak to some of our players. He's a business owner, and he does broadcasts for high school football, mostly in Northern California, but pretty much throughout California. And he talked about, having, being a young businessman and kind of up and coming, but he dealt with a little adversity recently, and where his offices were broken into, cameras, computers, you name it, laptops. They were pretty much $50,000 worth of items were stolen. And, he said, he could have easily gone about just sulking and packing up shop and just saying, hey, that's pretty much it. But yet instead he kind of harkened back to his days in grinding as far as football, and he applied that to just, overcoming the adversity. Now I'm going to figure this thing out. If I have to rig cameras and, buy some cheap laptops just to get my work done, I'll figure it out. And essentially that's what he did. And things are back booming, and he has a pretty successful business. As far as in the other elements, as far as sports and society, you can sports has a tendency of bringing people from different cultures together, different socioeconomic background. All facets of life. You name it. I was watching a movie a while ago where it talks about obviously in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the West Texas basketball team. It was a controversial move where they started 5 African American males, and it was the first time in history that ever happened. They went on to win the NCAA championship, but on that team, obviously they had white teammates and things like that, and those same white teammates could have gone and done other things within basketball or within the team, but yet they decided to band together and help fight against all the negativity that was coming towards the West Texas basketball team. And those boys went on and progressed and wound up winning the national championship against essentially an all-white basketball team, and coached by a very well-known coach in Adolph Rupp. Socially, you talk about the Colin Kaepernick situation and the kneeling for the flag. Whichever side of the argument you stand on, it brought about awareness. It brought people together. Essentially, when you heard comments from President Trump calling the players sons of bitches and stuff like that, at that point, I think regardless of whether you agreed with the protest or not, people showed signs of solidarity in, basically in going against, those comments that were said about him. Another element of sports and society, talk about 9/11, 9/11 was a terrible time in our history, and yet, games were canceled, but the moment, football games and other, baseball games and things like that started back up, it brought people together. People were able to band together, and in the midst of dealing with some tragic times, they used sports to kind of ease their pain and to help them get through whatever it is that they were going through. I mean, they're essentially a plethora of different things you can relate to as far as sports and society, but it definitely, there's a direct correlation. I mean, people use sports, as a way to pass time. People are indebted to their teams. I can definitely go on and on, but this is definitely a relatable situation as far as sports and society and how they kind of bounce off of one another. So yeah, pretty much it.